Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you for watching. In this video, I like to spend my time discussing Confucian philosophy, so the philosophy of Confucius. In the previous video, I talked about some history that was pertinent to thinking about the rise of Confucianism, and then I talked about the biography of Confucius in broad brushstrokes. And in this video, what I want to do is in broad brushstrokes talk about some of the philosophy that's relevant to Confucius. So I'm gonna confine myself to Confucius's Analects in discussing his philosophy. His Analects, they are known as a collection of Confucius's sayings and teachings put together by his students. So here's one theme. I'm going to talk about some themes here, and then talk about the Confucian virtues. So one theme that you find in the Analects is this idea that there is a focus on the everyday that matters. Not that the hereafter doesn't matter, but the focus on the everyday seems to matter in the following kind of way. So there's a famous scene in the Analects where one of Confucius's disciples is asking Confucius to teach him about things related to the spirits and death and all the rest. And Confucius quips back by saying, how am I to teach you about those things when you don't even know about this life? How you don't even know how to serve others around you, your fellow person in this life. And this gives us a sense of Confucius's valuing the here and now and the everyday, as opposed to just focusing on spiritual matters or focusing on the death that's going to come. He claimed that his aspirations in this life, in the Analects, were to bring comfort to the aged, to inspire trust in his friends, and to be cherished by the youth. These are all things that are related to the here and now. Now, I think Confucius thinks that you can be related to other things. You can be related to your family and your friends, and then your city, and then your state, and then your country, and then the world, and the whole world, the universe. But it begins really with those around you in everyday life, and there should be a kind of differentiated caring when it comes to the everyday. So there's a kind of emphasis on that, as opposed to thinking maybe about the hereafter, as other perhaps religious traditions would have it, and other philosophies may have it. Okay, you also find in him the theme of revivalism in the Analects. You find this theme that, like, what Confucius is trying to do is bring back traditional ideas, but not for the sake of tradition, not for the sake of being conservative with respect to traditional values, but for the sake of bringing back these ideas to transform the current state of the world. So we remember that Confucius was born into a world where there was constant warring, where there was anarchy, and he wanted to offer an account of how to change that world. Well, his solution is going to involve bringing back what we learn or what we know from the ancients, but to do so in a revivalistic manner, to change things up, to transform the way the world is, not to keep it the same, not to bring it back to the way it was. Someone who comes to mind here is Martin Luther King Jr., someone who wasn't traditionalist, wasn't conservative, but was rather revivalist in his approach. He revived ideas from the Bible. He revived stories from the life of Jesus from the Bible. He revived passages from the Old Testament, and also documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. And he took these ideas and he presented them in ways that were supposed to transform the world of segregation in the 1960s in the United States of America. So that was significant to his civil rights message. It was a revivalist message. Like, let's bring back these ideas that we know from the past, that we cherish, And so let's see how they actually transform and can transform the world in which we're living. Confucius was someone who was bringing back ideas in a similar kind of vein. There's an emphasis in Confucius on the family, where he thinks that the family is where it all starts when it comes to one's development. Morality is very, very important to Confucius, and the morality begins in the family. And we're going to see that there's a concept of human-heartedness that he develops. The concept is called Ren. The term is Ren, and it is a term, or Ren is it's a feature of someone who has become good. It's the most important good that you can attain. It's the most important of all the virtues, according to Confucius. And he wants to say that this goodness, it begins in the family. So he emphasizes the family in his teachings. So there's a famous passage early on in analytics that goes like this: once the roots are firmly established, the way will grow. The way here is translated as the Tao. So there are connections to Taoism here, but the way for Confucius has more moral connotations than it does natural connotations for the Taoists, but that's for another video lecture. The passage continues, might we not say that familial piety, the virtue that comes with being a good family member, and respect for elders constitute the root of goodness? And the goodness here is understood as Ren, this kind of human-heartedness. Okay, so there's emphasis on the family that we find. Not that our relations with those who aren't our family don't matter. We find passages elsewhere where Confucius talks about how that everyone within the 4 C's is one's brother, and of course we can add to that one sister. So everyone within the 4 C's is one's brother or sister. So it's a very beautiful idea that we have from Confucius. Not only are we members of our own family, but we're also all members of the same family in virtue of being human beings. Okay. Another common theme that we find is ritual, and a kind of functionalism associated with ritual. We don't perform rituals for the sake of ritual. We perform them for the sake of cultivating our virtues. So the concept here is li. And there are 3 senses of li that you're going to find in Confucian thinking. One is religious rituals and activities. So religious rituals involving divination, praying to spirits, relating to spirits, funerals and dancing and these kinds of things. There's etiquette, everyday normal etiquette, like how we greet each other, what kinds of addresses to have for one another, conversation norms, meals and how we're supposed to eat our food and dine together, etc. And then lastly, sometimes the li just most broadly understood just is like a kind of ethics, like it's the way in which we're supposed to live our lives, and you'll find it used in those 3 different senses. But the point of li, the point of ritual, is not the rituals themselves, but it's to put our hearts in certain states so that way we can cultivate the virtues required for becoming human-hearted, for becoming good and caring toward those around us and being able to serve others around us too. So it's very important that we feel the ritual, not just do so in a hollow kind of way. Okay, the last theme is really ethical cultivation, which is related to li, as I just mentioned before. But we want to cultivate virtue in our lives. So the kind of ethicist you could say Confucius is, if it's fair to do such a thing, is he's kind of virtue ethicist. Virtue is at the core of his ethical system. We need to cultivate the virtues. We need to become the kinds of people who can act correctly in the world. Okay? And when we become certain kinds of people, we can act correctly in the world, we can perform the rituals that we need to for the right reasons in the right kind of way. Now, it's important that we're virtuous because being virtuous is going to help with the anarchy problem that I discussed in my previous video lecture. So remember, Confucius is very concerned about changing society, about transforming society. and he thinks he has insights on how to do so. He thinks the insight is related to the concept of virtue. Get people to become virtuous, and that'll get people to follow the laws. But not just follow the laws because they're being told to do so and forced to do so, but get them to genuinely want to because they are virtuous people to follow the laws. And he thought that the key insight, the key thing that had to happen was that the rulers had to be virtuous. So this is something that he's trying to revive from the ancient past. So the Chu dynasty that emerged 500, 600 years before Confucius came into existence is one that began with these very virtuous leaders, and that led to several hundred years of the golden age of life in the Chu dynasty. And Confucius is trying to say that what we need is to hearken back to that time period in the following way. We need to have virtuous leaders, and the virtuous leaders can transform the world that we're now living in. There's almost like a trickle-down theory of virtue that's working here, okay? Wherein if the rulers are properly virtuous, then that will lead, in the way in which they rule, will lead the citizenry to become virtuous. And then by being virtuous, we have the right characters, the right dispositions to follow the laws, and anarchy would cease to prevail. Law and order would prevail. Excuse me. So he has a kind of a philosophy of education here that he develops. If you learn without thinking what you have learned, you will be lost. If you think without learning, however, you will fall into danger. So we need to be educated. We need the rulers to establish institutions that allow for the proper education. It's with that education that we can cultivate the virtues as citizens. Again, the ruler is going to rule in a way that isn't so domineering. They're going to rule in such a way that people see their virtue and want to be like them. Okay? That doesn't capture the whole story there, but that captures at least some of the story. Okay, so that captures, or at least those following 5 themes capture quite a bit of what we see happening in and through the Analects. There's much more to talk about, but I need to segue to the virtues. So when it comes to Confucius's virtues, the goal is to really focus Ren, as I've mentioned before. Ren, this idea of human-heartedness and human goodness. Now, the ways in which we achieve Ren is predominantly through Li, as I've already mentioned before, acting in accordance with rituals, acting with propriety, and doing so for the right kinds of reasons. Confucius seems to think that this is really the central virtue that helps us achieve Ren, although there are other virtues that are important. But following the rituals is very significant, again, for the right reasons. It's a very significant virtue for achieving Ren. There's also the ritual known as Xiao, which is translated as filial piety, as I've mentioned a little bit before too. The idea that we relate to our family members in virtuous kinds of ways. That's developed in the family, and that will ultimately contribute to our Ren as well. There's also the virtue of what's called Yi, which is acting rightly. It's just right conduct, which is ultimately related in some sense to Yi in its broadest understanding, but rightness is more all-encompassing, as it were. It needn't involve practicing and performing rituals. It's just really just right conduct. And then there's the virtue of Cheng Ming, which is the rectification of names. And this is a significant one because it involves crucially calling things by their names, okay, and being accurate in how we describe things, because when we're accurate in how we describe things, we'll also see that there's normative content in the way we describe things. Like what it means to be a brother really means something significant for how we should live our lives. That concludes Confucianism. Thank you for watching, everybody.